Welcome to this session from John Wesley's House and the Museum of Methodism. I'm Gemma Smith and I'm the Learning and Community Engagement Officer for the museum. This session should take around 45 minutes to an hour and you'll need a computer or tablet with the sound on, a pen, some paper and a bit of imagination. If at any point you need to pause the presentation, just right click on the slide to press pause and then right click again to resume it when you're ready. During this session, we're going to explore who John Wesley was. We're going to have a brief overview of the 18th century. We'll be thinking about how John Wesley used writing and speaking to express himself and how he tried to persuade others to change their views and also to inspire them. We'll also consider some of the causes that John Wesley spoke out about, and you'll also get the chance to write your own short speech. So let's begin with a bit more about who John Wesley was. He was born in 1703 in a village called Epworth in Lincolnshire. He was one of 10 children and his father was a Church of England minister, which means that he worked in a church. Now the 18th century is any date that begins with 17. So anything from 1700 up to 1799 is the 18th century. Now, the 18th century overlaps with the Georgian period. So we're going to have a quick look at a timeline to help us understand a bit more about this period of time. By looking at the timeline, we can see that John Wesley was born right at the beginning of the 18th century in 1703. The Georgian period overlaps with most of the 18th century, and it's called the Georgian period because there were 4 kings, all one after the other, that were called George. George I became king in 1714, and he ruled until 1827 when his son became King George II. In 1760, George II dies, and his grandson becomes George III, who's the longest reigning monarch of the period, right up until 1820. From 1811 to 1820, there's a period of time called the Regency period, and you might have heard of it before, as it's when the author Jane Austen was writing some of her books. George III actually became too ill to rule, so his son, the Prince Regent or future George IV, took over. George IV is then officially crowned the king in 1820 when George III dies. And George IV rules until 1830 when he dies, and his son then becomes William IV. When William IV dies in 1837, the next person in line to the throne is Victoria, who becomes Queen Victoria, and her reign is known as the Victorian period, so the Georgian period is right before that. So if we look at John Wesley's dates, we can see that he was alive for most of the 18th century and a big part of the Georgian period as well. He didn't die until 1791 and he was 87 years old, so he was quite old for the time. The pitch that we can see is Wesley's Chapel, which was opened in 1778, and it's still there today. It's used as a church, and on the same site is the house, John Wesley's house, where John Wesley lived the last 10 years or so of his life. So let's go back and think a bit more about who John Wesley was. As a young child, John was educated at home in Epworth by his mother Susanna, as were his brothers and sisters. But John was very lucky to eventually be able to go off to boarding school. At this time, it was mainly the children of wealthy families that went to school. And whilst John's family were not wealthy, he was awarded a scholarship to a school in London, which meant that someone else paid for his place. The school was called Charterhouse School, and it's now a museum that you can visit. And aged 10 in 1714, he went off to school there. He was there until 1720 and then went to Oxford University. Again, most people didn't go to university at this time. For example, no women were allowed to go to Oxford University until the 1870s, which is well over 100 years later. And it was way beyond the financial means of most families in the Georgian period. He finished university, and a few years later, in 1728, he became a minister for the Church of England and settled around Oxford as he liked it there. So can you just take a few minutes to think about something that you might have seen someone doing in a church or know that people do in a church? You can pause the presentation, just right click and press pause, and then right click when you're ready to resume. So some of the things you might have seen or know that people do in a church, you might know that people go to services there, perhaps on a Sunday. You might know that a priest or minister or vicar leads the service. You might have seen people singing hymns together. And also you might have seen people pray, either together as a group or individually. So by the time John was a minister in 1728, his younger brother Charles was also studying at Oxford. With his brother, John Wesley started a group with some friends called the Holy Club. They got together to read the Bible, but also to think about how they could help those most in need in the local community. They got a nickname, Methodists, as they had a very methodical approach to their faith and how to live. From this group, a way of life grew, and today John Wesley, as well as his brother Charles, are most well known for starting the Methodist Church. So have you heard of the Methodist Church before? If not, perhaps you could use Google Maps to look up if there's a Methodist church near you. When we're thinking about who John Wesley was, it's also important to think about the time that he was living in and how other people might have lived as well. So as well as working in the church, he spoke and wrote about the problems affecting the poorest people in society because he wanted to try and help them. During this time, a lot of people were very poor. The poorest people found it hard to afford 3 meals a day and usually would only have had one set of clothes. People lived in very overcrowded housing, with families sharing just one room where they would have cooked, slept, ate, and also lived. If people got sick, it was unlikely that they could afford to see a doctor or pay for medicine, as healthcare wasn't free at this time. So the poorest people in society really did have a very tough time. And John Wesley and people like his brother Charles thought the church should be doing more to help those most in need. During this session, we're going to look at 2 objects from the museum that link to John Wesley and the causes that were important to him. We're going to look at one now, and then we've got an activity related to it, and then we'll look at the second object, and there's another activity. So this one is a pulpit. You might have seen one in a church before, and it's where the person leading the service stands to speak to people. This one is from a chapel called the Foundry Chapel, and it's over 250 years old. The building is no longer there, but it was about 5 minutes away from where Wesley's chapel is today. John Wesley would have used this pulpit to talk to people during services at the chapel. When he stood in it, he would have been a bit higher than the people in the church. Why do you think that's important? Just take a few moments to think about that. So one of the reasons that everybody would have been sat in rows in the church, so by being a bit higher it would have helped everyone to see him. Also remember there would have been no microphones at this time, so being a bit higher above the crowd would have helped his voice carry so everybody could hear him. Even though John worked for the Church of England, he thought the church should be doing more to help those most in need. He also worshipped in a slightly different way, and this wasn't always very popular. He wanted to use his position to speak to lots of people about what he believed and also to try and get them to help others. Many people, including those from the Church of England, didn't agree with what John believed. Even some of John's own family were worried about what he was saying. Some people might say that John was brave for standing up for what he believed in, especially against people like the Church of England. But John was convinced that he was doing the right thing. Over time, more and more people did listen to and follow him, and this movement eventually became the Methodist Church. John Wesley didn't just preach in one place. Because he wanted to speak to as many people as he could, he travelled all over the country, mainly on horseback. Sometimes churches wouldn't let him use their pulpits, so he just spoke outside to people. sometimes under a tree or in a field, and this meant lots of people could listen to him. In this country in the 18th century, Methodism became very popular, especially with working class people. Some of them were worried about going into church, so being able to listen to someone outside was very helpful. In section 1, we've thought about who John Wesley was, the time in which he lived, the beginning of the Methodist Church, and how John Wesley spoke about issues that were important to him. We're now going to complete our first activity sheet, and through the sheet we're going to think about how we use language to express how we feel when we're talking. And to do this, we're going to use an extract from John Wesley's diary that he wrote in 1736. So this is the first extract, and it was written by John Wesley on the 25th of January 1736. At this time he was on his way to America. He'd been sent there to help set up some churches, and on the way there was a very bad storm, and he wrote about it in his diary. So I'm going to read out the extract for you, and then in the next few slides I'll just quickly run through the activity sheets for you to have a go at. At noon our third storm began. At 4 it was more violent than before. Now indeed we could say the waves of the sea were mighty and raged horribly. They rose up to heavens above and clave down to hell beneath. The winds roared around us and whistled as distinctly as if it had been a human voice. The ship not only rocked to and fro with the utmost violence, but shook and jarred with so unequal grating emotion that one could not but with great difficulty keep one's hold of anything, not stand a moment without it. Every 10 minutes came a shock against the stern or side of the ship, which think should dash the planks into pieces. With the presentation, there'll be 2 activity sheets for you to download. This is the first page of the first one here. The activity sheet should take about 20 minutes, but it could take longer depending on how many of the activities you do. If you didn't want to do all in one go, you could always come back and do some of the activities later. So for the first activity, what you're going to do is look at one of the images from the museum that depicts the scene on board the ship. So you're going to examine the image for clues that tell you there was a storm. And then secondly, you're going to have a think about how we use our voices for effect. And you're going to have a go at reading either the whole extract or maybe just 1 or 2 sentences, because it is quite long. And use your voice to try and express that in different ways. So how do you make your voice sound happy, sad, scared or excited? And the reason we're thinking about how we use our voices is when you're speaking publicly, it's important to convey your emotions and get that across to the crowd. So you'll have a go at those activities and then move on to the second section. On page 2, what you're going to do is work through the sentences that you can see here, and you're going to be changing the wording in the sentences to express different things, and that's to get us thinking about the language we use and how to give different meanings with the different words that we use. And finally, if you look at the picture again, you'll notice there are some children on board the boat. So what you're going to do is imagine that you are one of those children and write a short diary extract about the storm. If you like, you can use drama to try and recreate the scene. And the diary extract you write doesn't have to be very long. It could just be a few lines. But what we're trying to do is think about how we set the scene with the words we're using and how we express the different feelings with the language that we're using. So when you're ready, just move on to the next section. With the diary extract, you could always leave this until later if you wanted to. We'll now look at the second object from our collection that linked to John Wesley and some of the causes that were important to him. Do you know what this object is? So it's a quill, and do you know what a quill is used for? Just have a few seconds to think about that or talk about it. So this is used for writing and it's made from a feather, and you'd cut a point at the end and then dip it in ink to write with. And this particular quill was used to write one of John Wesley's last letters before he died. John Wesley was an abolitionist, and this meant that he wanted to ban the transatlantic slave trade. The slave trade supported a lot of the wealth of Great Britain at this time, but John felt the way slaves were treated was incredibly cruel, and this treatment of people could never be justified. The letter he wrote with this quill was to a man named William Wilberforce, who campaigned in government for the abolition of the slave trade. Eventually, the slave trade was banned, but not until 1833. The transatlantic slave trade saw people mainly from the West Coast and Central Africa forcibly taken from their homes and sailed thousands of miles across the ocean, who were then forced to work in awful conditions without pay. This image shows one of the slave ships. They were so overcrowded and the conditions were so awful that many people died on the journey. Those people that survived were used on plantations in places like the Caribbean and the southern states of America to grow goods like sugar, cotton and tobacco. They were becoming much more popular consumer goods in the 18th century. The work was back-breaking, incredibly long hours in the hot sun with no proper food, clothing or accommodation, and the people were treated very cruelly. We can see in the images here, the cotton on the left there, this would have to be picked by hand. The central image is of a sugar cone. Now, sugar was transported in cones because it was easier, and it was very hard, so you had to use the scissors shapes that you can see at the top there to cut any sugar off to use. And the last image is a tobacco twist. John Wesley, like many others, wanted the slave trade to stop. He tried to persuade those in power to make it illegal by speaking and writing about abolishing the slave trade. From the pulpit and with his sermons and speeches and through his writing, John Wesley tried to persuade people to think differently, and he also wanted to inspire them to take action. So what I want to do is just pause for a few moments and try and think about someone who's spoken about a cause that's important to you, or maybe has made you change your mind about something. For the second activity, you're going to have a go at creating a short speech about something that's important to you. As inspiration, we're going to use this quote from John Wesley from a short book or pamphlet called Thoughts on Slavery that he wrote in 1774. So I'll read the quote out and then we'll go through the activity sheets. Whatever you lose, lose not your soul. Nothing can countervail that loss. Immediately quit the horrid trade. At all events, be an honest man. Whether you are a Christian or no, show yourself a man. Be not more savage than a lion or a bear. Give liberty to whom liberty is due, that is, to every child of man, to every partaker of human nature. Once you've downloaded the sheet, you'll see there are 4 pages. The first page is just a bit of a recap of some of the things we've talked about already, and the quotes there as well. I'm also going to ask you to think about a time that you tried to persuade someone maybe to change their mind or to do something for you. The second page just gives some examples of how John Wesley used the language in the extract to try and persuade people to change their minds. And also, I'm going to ask you to start thinking about a cause that's important to you that you might want to speak about. So these are the last 2 pages of the activity, and the third page where it says write a short speech, that just gives some tips to help you write your speech by dividing it into 4 sections. And on the right hand side there we've got a template which you're welcome to use, or you could just use some paper you've got at home. So you could do a draft, put down some notes, and then write it up into longer sentences. Once you've finished, you could ask someone in your house to listen to you, and maybe you can ask them for their feedback about your speech. Remember, you don't have to write a really long speech, it could just be a few lines. This is just about practicing using our voices and language to express different things and to try and get our argument across. That's the end of the session, so well done and thank you for taking part. One question that you might have is, did John Wesley really make a difference? Because it wasn't until 1833 that the slave trade was fully abolished. But I think the answer is yes, he did. Firstly, it's important to stand up for what you believe, and John Wesley certainly did that throughout his life. And secondly, although it was nearly 40 years after he died that the slave trade was abolished, by applying pressure and getting the public on side over several years, together the abolitionists did get the government to listen. And even though it took a long time, it was of course worth it in the end. Sometimes it can take a long time to persuade people in power to change, but it's important that we continue to speak out about what we believe in. So thanks again, and I hope you enjoyed the session.